From Los Angeles, California, the entertainment capital of the world, it's the 80s Movie Podcast. I'm your host, Edward Havens. Thank you for listening today. On this episode, we're going to revisit a topic that one simply cannot avoid when discussing 1980s movies, the Brat Pack, and talk about the quintessential Brat Pack movie, Taps, which just happens to be the first Brat Pack movie. We've already talked about the Brat Pack a number of times over the preceding 6 years of this podcast, including last year, after the release of Andrew McCarthy's whiny documentary about the Brat Pack called Brats. But why revisit again, and why revisit it now? June 10th, 2025 was the 40th anniversary of the release of writer David Blum's New York Magazine cover story from which the Brat Pack got its name. And in June of 2024, Blum wrote yet another article, this time for New York Magazine's sister entertainment website Vulture, defending and standing by his article from 4 decades before. And before I get started, I want to apologize to Tony, a friend from high school, who will probably be very displeased with the next section of this episode. As a reminder, there were exactly 8 core members of the Brat Pack, with 3 others sorta waiting in the wings. Emilio Estevez was the unofficial president of the Brat Pack, the Frank Sinatra or Humphrey Bogart, depending on which version of the Rat Pack you most identify with, to everyone else's big star but second-tier status. Then there was Nicolas Cage, Tom Cruise, Matt Dillon, Timothy Hutton, Rob Lowe, Judd Nelson, and Sean Penn. Anthony Michael Hall was not a core Brat Packer. Molly Ringwald, not a core Brat Packer. Robert Downey Jr., not a core Brat Packer. Andrew McCarthy, still not a core Brat Packer no matter how badly he wants it. Demi Moore, she might have dated Timothy Hutton and might have been engaged to Emilio Estevez for a while, but she was never a core Brat Packer. Neither was Ali Sheedy, Jennifer Grey, Jamie Gertz, or any other woman. Nor was Tim Robbins, John Cusack, John Cryer, James Spader, Josh Brolin, Corey Feldman or Corey Haim, Kiefer Sutherland, Keanu Reeves, Patrick Swayze, Alan Ruck, Clayton Rohner, Emilio's younger brother, Charlie Sheen, Casey Srmashko, Val Kilmer, John Stockwell, or any other teen or 20-something actor from the day, including the 3 that I hinted at earlier that could have been Brat Packers but weren't. Matthew Broderick and Matthew Modine, both who were greatly liked by the members of the Brat Pack but lived in New York City, and thus would not be partying and club hopping with the guys in Los Angeles, and Kevin Bacon, who did live in Hollywood but for some reason never became a part of that life. Let's just call the rest of them extended members of the Brat Pack. So if we consider the core members of the Brat Pack as being only 8 actors, all young men between the ages of 21 and 26 in June of 1985, who were either on the brink of stardom or, in the case of Timothy Hutton, an Oscar-winning actor, how many actual Brat Pack movies are there? For my purpose, I'm going to define a Brat Pack movie as any movie released in the theaters between January 1st, 1980 and December 31st, 1989 that starred at least 2 core members of the Brat Pack. And by this count, there are only 5 movies with 2 Brat Packers, including Tex from 1982, Rumblefish from 1983, Racing with the Moon from 1984, and The Breakfast Club and The Falcon and the Snowman, both from 1985. And there are 2 movies with 3 Brat Packers, Taps from 1981 and St. Elmo's Fire from 1985. For many, the quintessential Brat Pack movie would of course be The Outsiders, the only film to feature no less than 4 of the Brat Pack members in its ensemble cast: Cruise, Dillon, Estevez, and Lowe. There's also Fast Times at Ridgemont High from 1982, which stars Sean Penn, and features a 2-second non-speaking shot of a young Nicolas Cage as one of Brad's co-workers at All American Burger, and Never on Tuesday from 1989, which stars Peter Berg and Claudia Christian, but does feature Cage, Estevez, and Nelson in uncredited cameo roles. Those don't really count. But for me, the best Brat Pack movie is the one that barely gets mentioned when it comes to discussions about the Brat Pack, which, incidentally, would retroactively become the first Brat Pack movie, 1981's Taps. Taps began its life, like many a movie, as a novel. Born in 1913, Devery Freeman was a short story writer for such magazines as the Saturday Evening Post and the New Yorker in the late 1930s. Like many Americans after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Freeman enlisted in the military, specifically the U.S. Navy, where he went through officer training before being assigned to the Armed Forces Radio. During the war, he wrote training films and entertainment programs for Navy sailors and Marines after being one of the co-founders of the Naval Unit for the Armed Forces Radio. Although he had written one movie for the Hollywood studios before the war, 1939's long-forgotten Main Street Lawyer, Freeman was able to see firsthand how screenwriters had become practically invisible to studio bosses and how many writers were not always being given proper credit for their work on movies. After leaving the Navy, he would spend nearly a decade fighting to establish a guild for screenwriters, even during the age of McCarthyism when such activities were met with suspicion in both Hollywood and in Washington, D.C. In 1954, he would co-found the Screenwriters Guild, and then helped to reorganize that into the Writers Guild of America we now know. Freeman would spend decades working in Hollywood as a writer of comedic movies featuring the likes of Red Skelton and Francis the Talking Mule, before becoming an executive at CBS Television overlooking such comedy shows as The Dick Van Dyke Show, The Jack Benny Show, The Beverly Hillbillies, and I Love Lucy. Lucille Ball specifically asked for Freeman to supervise her show, as it was Freeman and his older brother Everett who had created her breakthrough character, Ellen Grant, in the 1949 movie Miss Grant Takes Richmond, her first opportunity to show off her comedic side after years of playing ingenues. After leaving the industry in the mid-1960s, Freeman would work on his first novel, a dramatic novel about a military school whose cadets revolt when threatened with the disarming and closure of the school, hoping for aid from a legendary U.S. Army general nicknamed Father Sky. That novel, Father Sky, would be released in early 1979, but a copy of the manuscript would make its way to producer Stanley R. Jaffe before the book was published. Despite being busy with the post-production of 1979's eventual Best Picture Oscar winner Kramer vs. Kramer, Jaffe would quickly purchase the movie rights to the novel for what the Hollywood Reporter called in February 1979 a six-figure sum. Jaffe would set the film up at Columbia Pictures, where he had a production deal. Robert Mark Kamen, who would eventually go on to write The Karate Kid based on his own experiences with bullies in New York City in the 1960s, was a young screenwriter in 1979 who had just sold his first screenplay, an adaptation of his own novel Crossings, to Warner Brothers for $135,000 at the behest of Richard Dreyfuss. Although that film would never get made, Kamen was becoming a hot screenwriter in Hollywood, and Jaffe would hire Kamen to work on the adaptation of the novel. The producer was hoping to get the movie in production by the fall of 1979, but Kamen's scripts, which would make significant changes to the novel, including beefing up the role of Brian Moreland, the cadet who would lead the revolt, was not going to the producer's wishes, and Kamen would be released from the project with a new production date set for mid-1980. Darryl Ponsican, the novelist of The Last Detail and Cinderella Liberty, who himself was a Navy veteran during the early days of the Vietnam conflict, would become the next writer on the film. With his military background, Ponsican would tighten up the script, which would attract the attention of director Peter Warner, the older brother of future Cosby Show and Roseanne producer Tom Warner, who had yet to direct a feature film but had won an Academy Award in 1976 for his AFI graduate short In the Region of Ice, based on a short story by Joyce Carol Oates. With a workable script and a director, Jaffe and his company would get to work on casting the film, which would need to rely on young unknowns for the cadets due to its $6 million budget. Over the course of 4 months, over 2,000 young actors were interviewed and auditioned for Brian Moreland, as well as two major supporting characters, Brian's best friends at the military academy, Alex Dwyer and David Shawn, as well as dozens of smaller speaking roles and more than 100 background actors. Amongst those seen would be Timothy Hutton, who in early 1980 had just finished his first major movie, Robert Redford's directorial debut, Ordinary People, and would be hired to play David Shawn. Sean Penn was not originally interviewed for the film, but when casting director Shirley Rich saw Penn perform in an off-Broadway play called Heartland, she knew she had found Alex Dwyer. Another actor who would impress Rich during his audition was a young man who had just been cast in a small role as a psychopathic student in Franco Zeffirelli's romantic drama Endless Love. Tom Cruise would get cast as one of the background actors, but his fortunes would soon change. Other up-and-coming actors to be cast in smaller speaking roles included Evan Handler, John P. Navin Jr., and Giancarlo Esposito. But as a scheduled shooting date inched closer, the film would suffer a series of defeats that threatened to derail the project altogether. First, in May of 1980, Peter Werner would leave the film due to the ever-constant, quote, creative differences, unquote, with his producer. Then, in early July, Columbia Pictures would put the film into turnaround, citing the lack of a major director or bankable star, and the budget growing from $6 million to $10 million as reasons why they were shutting it down. And 2 weeks after that, the Screen Actors Guild started a strike that would eventually last for 3 months. While the actors may have been on strike, that didn't stop Hollywood from making deals. 8 days after the strike began, 20th Century Fox would sign the newly Oscar-winning producer Jaffe to a production deal and would greenlight the film with a $14 million budget. Pending deals with George C. Scott as Brigadier General Harlan Bache, the commandant of the military academy, and Harold Becker, the director of The Onion Field and The Black Marble. Becker would sign on almost immediately, while Scott would join the production once the actor strike was over in October. Scott would find much of another major character in his acting career in his portrayal of Bosch, telling a reporter around the release of the movie that he had sympathy for Bosch. Quote, he lived by the rules. His values were Patton's values: duty, honor, country. He's a proud man, and the school officials won't give him his due. Of course, his influence on the cadets is imbalanced, and unfortunately, they have no perspective on the man, unquote. The movie would shoot completely in and around the Philadelphia area, mostly at the Valley Forge Military Academy in Wayne, Pennsylvania, about 20 miles from the city of brotherly love. Before production began in April of 1981, the young actors would be enrolled as temporary students at Valley Forge to undergo military academy training. They would be issued proper academy uniforms, given proper military-style haircuts, sleep in the campus barracks, and be trained and treated like any other cadet student at the school. Sean Penn and the other actors portraying members of the Academy's mounted cavalry had to go through extra training each day to learn the military horsemanship that would be required for them for only one single scene in the final film. Most of the cast would excel at their training, especially Tom Cruise, who would quickly find himself bumped up to Hutton's role as David Shawn, when Hutton himself was bumped up to the second lead of Cadet Major Brian Moreland, after he won a number of accolades for his role in Ordinary People. If you watch the clip of Hutton accepting his Best Supporting Actor Oscar for Ordinary People, you can see he already has his haircut to play Moreland, as filming on taps would begin the following week. Production started out smoothly with only one small hiccup. Director Harold Becker had wanted veteran character actor Ronnie Cox to play the role of Colonel Kirby, the leader of the military response to the Cadet Rebellion, but it was decided to cast another actor. However, that unnamed actor would be let go from the film after only 2 days, and producer Jaffe would have Cox on set in costume filming the very next day. And then the rains came. Because Valley Forge Military Academy was a functional school throughout filming, the production had to build replicas of Bache's office, the barracks, and a number of classrooms would be built in regularly unused areas of the campus as to try and minimize the effects of the production on the students and teachers. This would end up helping the production in unexpected ways, as a number of days that were supposed to shoot on the outdoor sections of Valley Forge would have to be scrapped because of the rains. At times, the unit production manager and the first and second assistant directors would create 2, 3, or sometimes even 4 different call sheets, and which ones would be used would often depend on the actual weather forecast the day of shooting. Scott and Hutton would often be found playing chess together, a multi-generational meeting of Oscar winners, although there is no record of how many games each man may have won. Production would be completed in late June, and the film would be prepped for an early December release. The film would open in 3 theaters in New York City on December 11th, the Gotham Cinema in Midtown East District, the Criterion Cinemas in Times Square, and the 34th Street Showplace in the Murray Hill District. In its first 3 days, the film would gross an amazing $117,199, despite major competition from other movies released that week in anticipation of the upcoming Christmas weekend, including the Chris Christopherson-Jane Fonda drama Rollover, Buddy Buddy, the final pairing of director Billy Wilder with actors Jack Lemmon and Walter Matthau, Pennies from Heaven, the big-budget musical drama featuring Steve Martin, Bernadette Peters, and Christopher Walken, and the second weeks of Warren Beatty's epic drama Reds, and the Henry Fonda, Katharine Hepburn, Jane Fonda drama On Golden Pond, along with Time Bandits, Absence of Malice, Body Heat, and eventual Best Picture Oscar winner Chariots of Fire, which had been in limited release for 3 months already, but was still doing gangbusters as it claimed more and more awards from major awards groups around the country. The following week, the movie would expand from 3 theaters in New York City to 455 theaters across the nation, grossing $2.1 million, which would put it in 4th place behind Neighbors, which would end up being the final pairing of Dan Aykroyd and John Belushi, Sharky's Machine, directed by and starring Burt Reynolds, and Absence of Malice. But on a per-screen average, Taps would be the second best in the nation for a national release. In Week 3, Christmas weekend, Taps would add another 31 theaters and see its gross jump 57% to $3.28 million. But then, a major push by Paramount Pictures would also see Raiders of the Lost Ark continually on screen since its June release, grossing $3.7 million, albeit on over 1,200 screens. In its 4th week, the movie saw another major jump in both the number of screens added, 130, and weekend gross. In 24 days, the film had grossed a then very good $14.9 million. The film would continue to do well through the early part of 1982, grossing at least $1 million per weekend for another 9 weeks. And Fox would stop tracking the film after 14 weeks of release with a final reported gross of $35.86 million. The reviews for the films were mostly good, although one unnamed critic for Los Angeles Magazine would sum the film up as being, quote, the Alamo meets the Strawberry Statement, with a bit of King of Hearts and Leave It to Beaver tossed in for good measure. Brutal. I saw Taps at least twice during my 9th grade Christmas break at the UA Marina 6 in Long Beach. Part of me, having just turned 14 the previous month, was intrigued by how far some older teenagers would go to hold on to something that wasn't quite real, and taking mental notes on the performances of both Sean Penn and Tom Cruise. I already knew from Ordinary People that Timothy Hutton was one to watch, but at this point in my movie-going life, I wasn't yet familiar with George C. Scott as I would become. I had yet to see The Hustler or Dr. Strangelove, or The Hospital or Patton. I had seen The Hindenburg when it came out in 1975, but I was only 7 at the time and wasn't thinking like a film buff quite yet. I would, of course, catch many of his best films in the years to come and mourned his passing in 1999. But Taps would be the first film I remember seeing him in. As of July 2025, Taps is readily available to rent and or purchase from Amazon, Apple TV, and Fandango at home. Thank you for joining us. We'll talk again soon. Remember to visit this episode's page on our website, the80smoviepodcast.com, for extra materials about Taps and David Blum's 1985 article about the Brat Pack. The 80s Movie Podcast has been researched, written, narrated, and edited by Edward Havens for Idiosyncratic Entertainment. Thank you again. Good night.